There is a lot of fabric to maneuver when you're trying to sit down in a dress that has a hem that is 7 meters long. So let's have a chat about this dress because it's a special one for me. So I think even if you're not someone who sews, most people can kind of understand and appreciate the concept of a milestone project. So something that you might have envisioned for a really long time, you know, that takes a little while to kind of get to. And then once you finally get there, it's just amazing to you. This dress is definitely that for me. And there's a reason why. If you've been following my content, you know that obviously I create my own sewing patterns, which is amazing. It means that you can completely customize whatever you want to make. You can put collars here and cuffs there and do that shape and that kind of fit, and everything is completely up to you. But the one thing that I've really been limited by over the last couple of years is fabric choices. Now, we have some good fabric stores in Australia, but I'm picky, you know, and I think if you're spending 10, 20, 30, 40 hours on a project, you're allowed to be picky about fabric. So I always kind of had this idea over the last couple of years that it would be really fun to design my own fabric. And that would mean that the dress is completely designed and made by myself. It's completely custom. And I thought, if I'm going to go to the extent to try and design a fabric print, then I want to design it in a placement print. Now, if you're not familiar with what that is, a placement print is when the design on the fabric is actually designed within the pattern pieces themselves. So that would mean that you actually have complete control over where things kind of start and finish on the garment. So that's what I did. So over the last couple of months, I have really been trying to identify, you know, a digital illustration style that was really going to be what I wanted to have in a fabric. It took me a long time to figure out what that would be. And I put a lot of effort into designing a fabric print that I was just in love with, that I would be really happy to wear. And that's where we are now. So really excited to show you this dress. This dress does have some similar elements to my first sewing pattern that I released, in the fact that they both have princess seams along the bodice and they're both a circle skirt, but this is a little bit different. This one has a full maxi length. So we've got a massive hem. We've got some really beautiful cuffs as well along the sleeves, and on the front of the dress, at the center front, instead of having the button loops, I've actually got a button placket and a t-shirt collar instead of the mandarin collar that I had on my first design. So if you do have my first sewing pattern that I released, you can probably really easily alter it if that's something that you're comfortable doing. Otherwise, this sewing pattern will be available on my Etsy store, of course, and I'm actually going to release the digital fabric files as well. So what that means is I'm not going to be actually shipping custom fabric out to customers, but the digital file will be available on Etsy, and that can actually be sent to a fabric printer in your country, and you can obviously print, you know, this exact design out on the fabric. I'm also going to have the option to be able to have the design printed in the placement print for this sewing pattern. So if you're interested in replicating exactly what I've made, there's obviously an option for that. So this video will start a little bit differently because I'll briefly kind of discuss how I designed the fabric before I go into the sewing tutorial that will match, you know, my pattern that's available on Etsy. So if you don't really want to watch, you know, the part about how I designed the fabric, then I'll pop, you know, a timestamp up here and you can just fast forward to that if you just want to skip that. So anyway, we're going to jump straight into it. We're going to talk a little bit about the fabric design and then we'll go straight into construction. So for my digital fabric design, I knew that I wanted to have watercolor style illustrations of real flowers. So I used Pinterest and a little bit of Google to find photos of flowers that I really liked. And then I imported them directly into Procreate, which is an app that you can use for illustrating on an iPad. Procreate is really cool because you can actually download little brush kits that give you different effects. So I actually went on Etsy and found a little watercolor brush kit that I liked, and that's what I used for all of my illustrations. So I would create a layer on top of the photo, and then all I would do was select one of the watercolor brushes that I really liked, and I would pretty much block color each flower. So the whole idea is I would look at the petal, I'd pick up the exact color that I could see on the petal and I'd color in a little bit, and then move to the next section, pick up a new color in a little bit, and keep going and repeating that cycle. So it's a little bit labor intensive. You know, as I mentioned, it took quite a long time to illustrate all of the flowers that I liked. And then I would just repeat that cycle. So once I was happy with the placement of color, I would go in with a blending brush that came with the brush kit that I purchased, and I would just blend out all of the colors so it looked really soft. One thing that I didn't do though is I would never blend the edges of the petal. I wanted them to look really crisp and firm, but everything inside the petal I would blend. Now, as you can see, I did that for quite a few different flowers. And once I was finished, I would just import those individually into a new document and start to kind of layer them in front and behind other flowers. Now, to add a little bit more depth, I would kind of have a play with creating some shadows, creating some highlights, just seeing what looked best. And then when I was happy with it, I would go through the process of creating a seamless pattern. Now, there's lots of tutorials on how to create a seamless pattern on Procreate on YouTube, so I'm not going to go into that in great detail. But a seamless pattern just means that it can be repeated along long lengths of fabric, and you won't actually see where the pattern starts and stops. Now, I also started to have a feeling that I made everything just a bit too saturated and bright, so I decided to order a few samples from Next State Print, which is who I use to print my fabric, and I tried 3 different opacities to see how bright or how diluted the colors would turn out once they're printed onto fabric. So I decided that a good medium would be around 75% opacity, and when I was happy with that, I went through the process of importing that design that I created into Illustrator, and I started to cut the design out of my pattern pieces. Now, you're seeing the very early stages, so I promise that it looked much neater than this at the end. I cut it out really, really closely to the pattern pieces so it looks really neat. But the whole idea is I can place that print anywhere that I like. Once I was happy with that, I submitted the files to Next State Print and waited very patiently until they arrived. And as you can see, I have my hands on my fabric for the first time here, which is just so exciting to me. I actually added a little bit more of the floral print in between my pattern pieces, just so I had some spare fabric to make the matching buttons with. And then I went through the process of cutting those pattern pieces out from the fabric. Now, this fabric is supposed to shrink by 5%, but it didn't shrink that much when I washed it and dried it. So after I cut out the pieces from the fabric, I actually got my pattern pieces and laid them over the top, and then just made sure that everything was cut down perfectly so that the dress wasn't too big in some sections. So for this design, I have included a really pretty trim, and I'll link where I got this trim down in the description box. The best way to make sure that your trim is always in the perfect position is to measure how much of the trim you want exposed from the seam allowance. And then what I actually do is draw a line on my pattern pieces where the seam allowance would be in a heat removable pen. And I align my trim along that seam allowance that I've drawn to make sure that it's always caught within the seam allowance. Now, a lot of this dress is sewn with French seams, but I don't like using French seams on curved seams. So when I'm attaching the center front to the side front bodice pieces and the side back to the center back bodice pieces, I actually just sew them with a normal seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters. And then I trim down the seam allowance and I finish off those edges with bias binding or bias tape. These are some of the only seams where I do that. We do have another one later on down the track, but we'll get to that. I then go ahead and join the front and back pieces by the side seams and the shoulder seams, but I use a French seam to do this. So if you haven't done a French seam before, the easiest way for me is to align the pieces with the wrong sides facing. I just sew with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance, and then you flip it open, press it out, and align that seam with the right sides facing, and sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. This creates a really easy French seam with no trimming needed. Then for the sleeve, we do have a sleeve slit. So once you've cut up that slit line, we actually need to create a little bit of bias binding with the fabric and cover this. So to prep this little piece of fabric, I folded it in half and folded the raw edges in towards that halfway point. So it's essentially like your own bias tape or bias binding. And then I've aligned this along the sleeve slit on the right side of the fabric. Now I sew this with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and it can be a little bit fiddly once you get to, I guess, the end of the slit. You do need to kind of maneuver the fabric around, but I promise it works out in the end. Once you've done this along both sides of the slit, you'll fold that bias tape or bias binding that you've made over and over again, and you'll be able to sew along the top of that bias binding that you've made, which will catch both the top and the bottom and secure it really well. Now to finish it off, we just fold it in half at the top of the slit, and on the wrong side of your sleeve, you're just going to sew a little diagonal point up to the corner, and that will keep the sleeve slit looking nice and neat. We're then going to sew the side seam of the sleeve together using a French seam. Now the next step is to sew a little basting stitch between the front and back notches on the sleeve cap, and we'll use this to gather all of the excess fabric at the sleeve cap into the armscye. To do a basting stitch, you just use your longest stitch length. I've then pinned some trim along the armscye on the right side of the fabric, and then we're going to place the sleeve cap into the armscye of the bodice. The right sides of the fabric will be facing, and first we're going to align the side seam of the bodice with the sleeve seam, and we'll pin that in place. We then pin the center notch of the sleeve cap to the shoulder seam on the bodice, and then we're going to use that basting stitch all around the sleeve to gather down the excess fabric until it matches the size of the armscye. I've used this technique before and I'm going to use it again, but before I stitch that all into place, I'm just going to insert one of these little folded tulle pieces. This essentially allows you to create a little bit more volume in the shoulder, and I align this along the edge of the fabric with the length of the tulle pointing in towards the sleeve. We're going to sew all around with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and then I finished off that edge with bias tape. To prepare the cuff, we're going to apply interfacing to the wrong sides of the cuff pieces, and then we're going to pin them with right sides together and stitch along the short sides and one of the longer sides with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And you can see that I've obviously added some trim in this seam as well. It's really important that you leave a gap of about 1 centimeter at the start and the end of your stitches so that we can fold the edges of the cuff in. We're then going to fold the cuff right side out and give it a good press. And along one of the raw unstitched edges, we're actually going to fold one of those sides in towards the inside of the cuff. And I try to aim for a fold of about 0.5 centimeters, and this will make a little bit more sense later. The other side that we haven't folded and pressed is going to be aligned with the hem of the sleeve. Now, we should align it right sides facing, and one thing I forgot to mention is that I did put a basting stitch around the hem of the sleeve, and that allows you to really easily gather this down to be the right length. We're then going to stitch along that edge with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And we're going to press all of the seam allowance down into the cuff and align the folded unstitched edge up towards the wrong side of the sleeve. From the right side of the cuff, you'll be able to pin along the edge where we've sewn, and this will actually catch the back side of that cuff, allowing you to stitch in the ditch along that ridge. So stitching in the ditch is just when you are stitching right in the fold of two fabric pieces that have already been joined together. It creates an invisible stitch from the front, but it will catch anything on the back that you need it to catch. It's then really smart to try on the cuff and mark out where you would like your buttons to lie. I use the buttonhole stitch on my machine to create little buttonholes. They look so cute. But one annoying thing is I set it up completely the same each time, but one was just slightly longer than the other, but no one can tell, it's fine. And I'm also not going to unpick all those stitches. But I actually place the start of my buttonholes a centimetre from the short edge of the cuff. For the skirt panels, the pattern pieces do have icons that you would match up to ensure that you're aligning the sides correctly. So we would do the center front to the side front skirt piece, which goes to the side back skirt piece, which goes to the center back skirt piece. It's much easier when you see the pattern pieces that have all the little icons to match. And we're then going to attach the bodice to the skirt panels with the right sides facing. So essentially you ensure that you're matching the center front raw edges and the center back raw edges of the bodice to the skirt. And then all of your princess seams on the skirt and the bodice should all match up perfectly as well. We're then going to stitch with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and finish with bias tape, and repeat for the opposite side, of course. I then suggest to hang the two sides of the dress for at least 24 hours, and you might decide to trim some excess hem as the skirt pieces will stretch due to some of the skirt being cut on the bias. This is unavoidable when you're working with a circle skirt. There is always going to be parts of the skirt that stretch a little more than others. So for the zip, we're going to measure the length of our zip and remove 5 centimeters from that length. So I have a 56 centimeter zip, so I'm going to measure 51 centimeters down from the neckline. The 5 centimeters is to accommodate for the seam allowance at the neckline, the collar stand that we're going to be adding in, and then just a little bit extra to cover the bottom of the zip. We're going to mark this with a line horizontal to that raw edge. I've drawn in about 1.5 centimeters in length. And then we're actually going to mark a little diagonal line, and this is going to guide us for our stitches. So I have aligned my center back pieces with the wrong sides facing, and I'm going to sew with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance from the hem up until that diagonal line. I'm then going to pivot on the diagonal line and draw right down to the end of that 1.5 centimeter line that we originally drew. You want to do a little bit of back tacking here to make sure it's nice and strong. We're then going to very carefully and very slowly cut down that original line that we drew, and also cut down the diagonal line. And this is going to remove a small little triangle from the fabric. This will allow you to take that seam that you just sewed and flip it completely inside out so that the right sides of the skirt pieces are facing. And we can then finish this area with a 1 centimeter seam allowance to create a French seam. To hem the dress, I've used 3.5 centimeter wide horsehair braid, and to protect the fabric from the raw edge of the horsehair braid, I've just fused a small amount of interfacing to that edge. I then align the horsehair braid to the right side of the hem of the dress, and I stitch with a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. You then press the horsehair braid out and away from the hem, and then again up and in towards the wrong side of the fabric. The horsehair braid will now be on the inside of the hem. We're then going to stitch along the hem 0.5 centimeter away from the upper unstitched edge of the horsehair braid, catching it within the stitches, and this will secure it to the hem. I'm then going to prepare the button placket by fusing interfacing to the wrong side of the button placket, and then we're going to fold and press the placket in half lengthways and press one of the long edges in towards the wrong side of the placket with a 0.5 centimeter distance from the edge. I've also added some trim to the unfolded raw edge of the placket. We're then going to align that edge to the raw edge of the center front of your dress, and we're going to sew this with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And then going to press the placket away from the center front of the dress, and you should be able to fold it in half and in towards the wrong side of the dress. The raw edge that you folded in the previous step will now be on the inside of the bodice and skirt. From the right side along the folded edge where the placket's been stitched, we'll be able to pin and stitch in the ditch to catch the folded edge of the placket on the other side. This will essentially close the placket. If you have excess placket at the hemline, I trimmed it to about 1.5 centimeters below the hem, and I've just folded it really neatly up inside the placket and made sure that I top stitched along that edge to secure it when we're performing our stitch in the ditch. So to prep the collar pieces, I've applied interfacing to the wrong sides of the collar stand and collar, and I've pinned together the collar pieces with the right sides facing and stitched them with a 1 centimeter seam allowance along the front, the back, and the free edge. I'm pretty sure I did it wrong in this video because I had to redo it, but I didn't refilm it. So don't pay any attention to that. Just look at the pattern pieces. They're completely labeled. I should have done that before I started. Of course, I've added trim in these seams as well. And through the open edge of the collar, we'll be able to turn the collar right sides out and give it a really good press. We're then going to take this unstitched edge of the collar. We're going to pin that to one of the right sides of the collar stand. The front of the collar should meet the notch on the collar stand. We're then going to place the other collar stand piece, again with the right sides facing the collar, straight on top. So essentially we have our collar stand pieces with the right sides facing and the collar is sandwiched in between. We're then going to stitch along this upper edge down to the curved side of the collar stand, and we're just going to leave a 1 centimeter gap at this edge. We do not stitch along the lower edge or the back of the collar stand, and the seam allowance is 1 centimeter. We can then turn the collar stand right sides out and give it a really good press. On one of the raw edges of the collar stand, we're going to press this with a 0.5 centimeter length from the edge. And of course, we're going to repeat this for the other side. We're then going to align the unpressed raw edge of the collar stand to the neckline of the bodice and stitch it with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. We can then press all the seams up into the collar, but we're going to leave them for now. We'll finish the collar at the end of the zipper installation. I don't know about you, but zippers are just so frustrating. Sometimes I love them, sometimes I hate them. But to install the zipper, I have pinned the zipper tape face down to the center back edge, facing the right side of the fabric. The top of the zip should be aligned with the top edge of the collar stand, which is where the two collar stand pieces intersect, not where the collar stand meets the neckline. We're then going to fold the collar stand inside out so that it's completely covering the zip. The right sides of the collar stand will be facing each other with the zipper sandwiched between them. We need to ensure that we're pinning the collar, which will be between these layers, completely out of the way so it's not caught when stitching the zip. This is very hard when you have quite a lot of trim popping out of it. We're then going to use an invisible zipper foot. We're going to stitch down the length of the zip as close to the teeth as possible, and you should be able to sew right down to the French seam that you created in the previous steps. I then finished off the edges of the center back seam and zipper tape with bias binding. To finish off and close the collar, we're going to fold the collar right sides out, give it a good press, and then we should be able to take that folded edge of the collar and bring it down to cover the seam line of where your collar met your neckline a few steps prior. Again, we should be able to pin along this seam line and stitch in the ditch, which will essentially catch that folded edge on the back of the collar and close the whole collar off. Now we need to mark and place our buttonholes on the dress. So buttonhole lengths are really specific to the size of buttons that you're using, but I suggest to use anywhere between 25 to 30 buttons. depending on what you like. And I like to use 2 on each cuff. I always suggest to make a mock-up of the buttonholes first. You just don't want to practice buttonholes the first time on your actual garment because there'll always be a mistake. And then to figure out how far away to space each buttonhole, we just do a simple calculation. Once I've done all my buttonholes, I use a little bit of fray check glue and I let that dry before using a buttonhole cutter to carefully open each buttonhole. To make the belt, I've cut 2 strips of buckram. The dimensions are specific to the size of belt that I want. It's mostly dependent on your belt buckle width and how much fabric you can fit in between that. And for the length, I usually suggest your waist measurement plus 20 to 40 centimeters extra at your preference. I then cut 2 pieces of fabric that are identical in width and length to the buckram. However, I've added a 1 centimeter seam allowance along all edges. I then just go through the process of folding and pressing and pinning this fabric around each piece of buckram. This is really labor intensive, but it's the easiest way that I can make a belt. I repeat this for the other piece of buckram and fabric, and then I line them on top of each other with the wrong sides facing. And I insert my trim in between the 2 pieces before top stitching around the entire length of the belt. I then use my machine to create a little circle stitch about 5 centimeters or so from one end of the belt. And then I just poke a sewing awl through it to create a hole. And this is kind of like the little insertion point for your belt buckle. We're then going to fold the excess fabric towards the back of the belt and stitch by hand or machine. For me, machine's just easier. This just secures the end of your belt in place. Then I've used a little birch eyelet kit to make my belt buckle holes. If you don't have a kit like this, then you can use the same circle stitch that I used in the previous step and create belt buckle holes that way. It's actually a really cute idea because you could use a thread that maybe matches the fabric that you're using. And then the belt loops are prepared in a really similar way to the shirt slip binding. So we're going to fold the raw edges of the belt loop pieces in towards the center of the fabric, fold it in half again, and then we're going to stitch down that folded edge to create some little strips. We're then going to fold each end of the belt loops in by 1 centimeter and press, and I just align the belt loops on the side seams, and I actually do one near the back zipper as well. And I stitch the edges down so that it's catching all of the raw edges inside the stitches. The final step is to make and sew on some little buttons. So I've used the extra fabric that I've printed with my design, and I've cut out small little circles to create little fabric covered buttons with. Now I am going to put a link to this button making kit in the description. It's just from AliExpress, but oh my gosh, it's so cute. It makes these perfect little buttons. And then I did forget to film myself sewing them on, but you probably didn't want to see me sewing on, 30 something buttons. It's a bit repetitive. And we are all done.
Your love's what I need. Your love is what I need.
So I hope you enjoyed watching that whole process. It's crazy that you can condense months and months of design and planning and construction into a video that's less than an hour long. But hopefully it's inspired someone to kind of take the leap in trying something that they haven't tried before. I have no digital design background, so it was a really big learning curve for me, but I feel like I learned so much and it's something that I'll definitely do again. So If it's inspired you to do the same, then definitely let me know. And I look forward to seeing you in my next video with my next project.